All right, buckle up, everybody, because today we are taking a deep dive into the most complex machine you own, your brain. We're going to be talking about Steven Pinker's How the Mind Works and how he explains this amazing organ.
Oh, it's really interesting how Pinker uses such a simple analogy to get at something so complicated.
Yeah.
He compares the brain to a biological computer, like it's always taking in info, spitting out results. But this computer, oh, it's so much more complex than any silicon chip.
It's a great way to think about it, I think, because we use computers every day.
Right.
But what I think really makes it hit home is that example he uses in that YouTube video summary.
Oh, yeah.
A 4-year-old putting a toy away.
Okay.
It seems so simple,
Right.
but think about it. For that child to be able to do that, their brain is processing visual data, calculating spatial relationships, coordinating muscle movements. It's just this massive amount of computation happening in an instant.
Absolutely. It's a symphony of computations.
It is.
For something so simple, it's incredible.
It makes you realize that even like the most basic things we do require a huge amount of brain power.
Oh, yeah. We take it for granted.
So in this deep dive, we're going to tackle some of the big questions that Pinker asks in his book, What Iced the Mind? How did evolution shape it? And can science even explain consciousness?
Okay, so Pinker makes this pretty bold statement. The mind is essentially what the brain does. It's not some separate entity, but the result of all those electrical and chemical signals, all those neurons
All those things happening in our heads.
zipping around in your head. That's right.
So everything that we experience, from grabbing a pizza to our most deeply held philosophical beliefs, is all just neurons firing.
Yeah, that's the idea.
Whoa.
It's encoded in the structure and activity of your brain. And to kind of make sense of how this jumbled mass of neurons produces such intricate thoughts and behaviors, Pinker introduces this concept of mental modules.
Okay, I like that. Let's unpack that a little.
That's true.
What are mental modules?
So imagine your brain is like a Swiss Army knife with specialized tools for different tasks. And Pinker suggests that our minds are organized in a similar way,
Okay.
with dedicated modules for vision, language, memory, emotion. They're all working together.
So it's not just one big blob of brain activity.
Nope, it's structured like departments.
All right.
It's like a well-oiled machine.
That makes sense.
So for example, like your visual system, it's a marvel of engineering.
Right.
You're taking in 2D images from your eyes, but your brain is constructing a 3D world full of depth and movement.
I never really thought about it that way.
Yeah.
I just, I see. I don't think about the mental gymnastics involved.
It happens so effortlessly, but it's an incredible feat of computation.
It really is.
And speaking of computations, you know those optical illusions that always kind of mess with our brains?
Oh, yeah, I love those.
Well, those illusions, they kind of exploit these quirks in our visual processing modules. They're like these little hacks that reveal the hidden rules that our brains are using to interpret the world around us.
It's so humbling to realize that our brains can be tricked like that. It makes you wonder how much of what we perceive is actually accurate and how much is our brain just like filling in the gaps.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder, and that's where science helps us kind of understand how those modules work
Yeah.
and how they might sometimes lead us astray.
Right.
And that makes you think, where did these incredibly complex modules come from?
Evolution, right. It's not like they just appeared overnight.
Exactly. It's millions of years of natural selection.
Yeah.
Favoring those brains that were good at solving problems and surviving in, these difficult environments.
So you're saying my love of pizza or my fear of spiders or my ability to do a crossword puzzle, those are all thanks to my ancestors who faced similar challenges.
In a way, yeah. Think about it. Your brain is like a collection of ancient survival tools passed down through countless generations,
That's
shaped by challenges like finding food, avoiding predators,
right.
and navigating all those tricky social situations.
Social situations. Oh, tell me about it.
Right.
So it's nature versus nurture.
Well,
It's always a bit of both.
Pinker pushes back against that blank slate idea
Oh, okay.
at birth.
Interesting.
He argues that genes play a big role in shaping our mental structures, our predispositions.
Right.
That doesn't mean we're just puppets of our DNA, though.
Of course, our experiences matter.
Absolutely, your environment, your choices, they all matter.
Right, right.
He uses the example of the violence gene, kind of a controversial one.
Okay.
Some research suggests there might be genes that influence aggression, but they don't operate in a vacuum.
Right.
Environment and personal history play a huge role in how those genes are expressed.
It's a reminder to not oversimplify things.
Right.
Genetics is complex.
Very.
And we shouldn't jump to conclusions about behavior being predetermined.
Absolutely.
But this brings up another question for me. If our brains are these computational machines, how is all that information stored? Do we just have mental snapshots of everything we've ever seen or learned?
Pinker suggests it's not so literal. It's not like recording a video.
Right.
It's about creating mental representations.
Okay.
These representations are more abstract, capturing the essence of the information in different formats, like visual forms, abstract words, grammatical structures, even a language of thought that he calls mentalese.
Hold on. Mentalese. Yeah. What is that?
Think about when you read a book.
Okay.
You might forget the exact words, but you still remember the meaning, right?
Yeah, that's true.
So mentalese is like the language that your brain uses to think with, to process information.
Oh, yeah.
Even if you don't say those thoughts out loud.
So it's like an internal language that helps us understand concepts,
Yep.
regardless of the specific words that are used to express them.
Exactly. So we're not storing photographs in our heads. We're storing these abstract representations that allow us to generalize, to learn new things,
Right.
to access information efficiently.
That's incredible. It's like our brain is constantly translating between these different forms of representations.
All the time, following the scene.
Just to make sense of the world.
Exactly.
That's wild.
Yeah.
So speaking of computation,
Yeah.
what about those neural networks we always hear about?
Right.
Are those like mini brains in a computer?
So they're models inspired by the brain,
Okay.
kind of like simplified versions.
Okay.
Imagine like a network of interconnected nodes, kind of like simplified neurons,
Okay.
that can process information and learn from data.
So they're not actually thinking like humans, but they can sort of mimic some of the ways our brains work.
Exactly. Researchers use them to try and understand how our brains might learn, how they recognize patterns,
Okay.
even how they make decisions.
That's cool.
And what's really interesting is that even if some of the nodes get damaged, the whole system doesn't crash.
So they're robust, just like our brains.
Right. They're robust.
That's reassuring.
It is.
But it brings up another big question for me.
Okay.
If our brains are always processing information and generating new thoughts, how do we manage the sheer volume of possibilities? It seems like it would be totally overwhelming.
So you've hit on this key challenge.
Okay.
It's called a combinatorial explosion of thought.
Combinatorial explosion.
Yeah. So even with all those billions of neurons, the number of potential thought combinations,
Yeah.
astronomical,
Wow.
quickly exceeds what our brains can actually handle.
So our brains have like a storage limit?
It's not so much about storage as it is about the overwhelming number of possibilities.
Okay.
Pinker uses this chessboard analogy.
Okay.
Imagine putting 1 grain of wheat on the first square of a chessboard,
Okay.
2 on the second, you double it each time.
Okay.
By the 64th square, you would have more wheat than has ever been harvested.
Oh, wow. That escalated quickly.
Right.
I get it.
So how does our brain manage this?
Yeah. How did it?
Pinker suggests that our minds use this combination of fuzzy logic and rule-based systems.
Fuzzy logic? That sounds imprecise.
It's not necessarily imprecise.
Okay.
Fuzzy logic means our brains can work with shades of gray, degrees of truth. Think about how we categorize things. A tomato is technically a fruit, but we often treat it like a vegetable, right?
Yeah.
So it's like our brains can handle exceptions.
Uh-huh.
We don't need things to be perfectly black or white.
Yeah. Makes sense.
We can make decisions even when information is incomplete
Okay.
or ambiguous.
Yeah.
And we also rely on these rule-based systems,
Okay.
which are those more clear-cut logical frameworks.
Right. Like grammar rules?
Exactly. Like
Yeah.
grammar rules, mathematical formulas, those sorts of things.
So depending on the situation, our brains can switch between those different modes of thinking.
That's what makes the human mind so adaptable, so flexible,
Yeah.
right? We can be both flexible and logical, depending on what the situation calls for.
I like that.
But all this talk of computation makes me wonder about the biggest mystery of all consciousness.
Right. The hard problem of consciousness.
Yes, exactly.
How do we explain that subjective experience, that feeling of what it's like to be us,
Right.
if we're just biological computers?
It's the question that stumped philosophers and scientists for, centuries.
Right.
Even with all our knowledge about the brain, explaining that subjective experience remains a huge challenge.
So we're still in the dark about how those subjective feelings arise.
Well, not entirely. I mean, science is making progress.
Okay.
Think of it like studying, I don't know, a bat's echolocation.
Okay.
We might not know what it feels like to see with sound.
Right.
but we can understand the mechanisms behind it.
Okay.
It's about understanding the how and the why.
So we're getting closer, even if we haven't solved it completely.
Exactly. We're uncovering the neural correlates of consciousness.
Hmm.
The
Yeah.
brain regions and processes involved.
Right.
And it makes you wonder, how did something as complex as consciousness evolve in the first place?
It's a question that has puzzled thinkers for, like, ever.
It really has.
Yeah.
But Pinker uses the evolution of the eye as an analogy here.
Okay.
It seems impossible that such a complex organ could have just, arisen gradually.
Yeah, it feels like it needs all the parts to function at all.
Exactly. But simulations
Hmm.
by researchers like Dan Nilsson and Suzanne Pelger
Yeah.
show that a simple light-sensitive patch can, over time, with those gradual steps of mutation and selection, evolve into this complex eye.
Wow, so evolution can create complexity from simplicity over time.
Exactly.
That's
And
amazing.
Pinker argues the same logic applies to the mind.
Okay.
Those specialized modules and even consciousness, they didn't appear overnight.
Right.
They evolved step by step,
Mm.
offering those survival advantages along the way.
So it's like we're walking around with ancient software that's been updated over millions of years.
I love that analogy.
It's crazy.
It's really cool to think about it like that.
It is. But if it's all about these pre-programmed modules, where does learning fit in? Isn't our
Yeah.
ability to learn what makes us special?
Learning is crucial, but even our capacity for learning
Yeah.
is shaped by evolution.
Hmm.
Pinker points to a study by Jeffrey Hinton and Stephen Nallen,
Okay.
who used these neural networks to model how learning and evolution might interact.
Interesting. Tell me more.
So they gave these networks a complex task to learn.
Uh-huh.
Some networks started with, like, no prior knowledge,
Okay.
and others had a few pre-wired connections, representing innate knowledge.
So some had a head start.
Exactly. And the ones with that built-in knowledge,
Yeah.
they learned much faster,
Mhm.
more efficiently.
That makes sense.
And over time, the simulation favored the networks with more of those innate connections.
So learning itself led to more innateness in the system.
It's a really cool concept, right?
That's a wild concept.
It highlights how our ability to learn is tied to our evolutionary history. We're not just those blank slates. We come preloaded with some impressive software.
That has implications for how we think about education. Instead of treating students like empty vessels,
Yeah.
we need to understand how their brains are wired to learn
Right.
and tailor our teaching methods accordingly.
Right.
That's fascinating.
It really challenges how we think about teaching, right?
It does. It does.
How we approach education.
It really does.
Makes you think.
It makes you think a lot. It makes you think about everything differently, honestly.
And all these things we've been talking about the human brain,
Yeah.
it makes you wonder about animal intelligence. Because we tend to put humans at the top, right?
Right.
But each species has a brain specialized for its own way of life.
Right. A dolphin is not going to be good at climbing a tree.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Pinker actually argues against ranking intelligence on a single scale
Okay.
because each species excels in different areas.
Right. Like a squirrel burying a nut.
Right. Think about ants with their incredible navigation,
Right.
or bees with their intricate communication systems.
Yeah.
They might not solve complex equations,
Right.
but they have these cognitive skills perfectly suited to what they need to do.
Right. It's about being the best at what you do, not about fitting some arbitrary human definition of smart.
Exactly. It's about surviving, thriving in your own niche.
Right. But what about us?
What sets the human brain apart, you mean?
Yeah. How did we get so different?
So our story begins millions of years ago with our primate ancestors.
Okay.
Pinker traces these key changes that set us on a different evolutionary path.
Okay.
Walking upright was crucial.
Really? So standing up was good for our brains.
It was a game changer. It freed our hands for tool use,
Okay.
and it led to these increasingly complex cognitive abilities.
It's amazing how these things are connected.
It's all connected.
Yeah, we stand up, our hands are free, we start using tools, our brains get bigger and more complex.
That's the gist of it.
It's wild. It's like a chain reaction leading to us.
Right. Leading to human intelligence as we know it.
Exactly. But if we're so shaped by our past, how much control do we really have over our own behavior?
Right.
Are we just running on autopilot, driven by those ancient instincts?
It's a question that really gets to the heart of what it means to be human.
It's a little unsettling to think about, honestly.
It can be, But Pinker argues that even those seemingly flexible behaviors
Mm.
are actually rooted in instincts that have been honed by natural selection.
Okay.
He quotes William James, who said, "Not one man in a billion, when taking his dinner, ever thinks of utility. He eats because the food tastes good and makes him want more."
So true. Like, I never stop to analyze why I want that second slice of pizza. I just go for it.
Right, it's instinct.
Yeah.
Those feelings, those intuitions,
Yeah.
they're often rooted in those instincts that have evolved over time
Right.
to help us survive and reproduce.
So how much of our behavior is really conscious choice versus just following these ancient programs?
That's the big question.
It is.
But Pinker suggests that by understanding those evolutionary influences,
Yeah.
we can actually gain more control.
Okay.
If we know how our minds are wired,
Mm.
we can make more conscious and informed decisions.
Right.
It's like shining a light on those hidden biases
Right.
and impulses
Yeah.
that might be driving our behavior.
So knowledge is power, even when it comes to our own instincts.
Absolutely.
Can you give me some specific examples of how this plays out in everyday life? I'm really curious now.
Sure, let's start with vision.
Okay.
Remember how we were talking about how our brains construct a 3D world from 2D images?
Yeah.
Pinker describes vision as a description building machine.
Description building machine? What do you mean?
Imagine you're looking at a book from different angles, right?
Right.
The image on your retina is changing,
Yeah.
but you still perceive it as being a rectangle.
Right.
So your brain is actively creating a description of that object,
Okay.
using its knowledge of the world to make sense of what it's seeing.
So my brain is filling in the gaps,
Exactly.
using its knowledge of the world to make sense of what I see.
That's exactly what it's doing.
Wow.
And depth perception is another great example.
Okay.
Each eye sees the world slightly differently,
Mm-hmm.
and our brains use that tiny difference to actually calculate distance.
It's incredible how we can do that.
It is. It's called stereo vision.
That's so cool.
It really is.
But are there times when those assumptions that our brain is making, filling in the gaps,
Yeah,
lead us astray?
absolutely. Our brains are always relying on these shortcuts
Okay.
to process information quickly.
Mm,
And those shortcuts can sometimes lead to illusions
right.
when those assumptions are violated.
Okay.
So for example, we assume that objects are opaque, right? Meaning you can't see through them.
Yeah.
This helps us make sense of these overlapping images,
Okay.
but it can also create those illusions when that assumption is false.
Oh, so our brains can be tricked by their own cleverness.
Exactly.
That's amazing.
Those shortcuts are usually helpful,
Right.
but they also remind us that our perception isn't always an accurate reflection of reality.
Right. Right.
It's an active construction, not just a passive recording.
That's a great point.
So our brains are building things all the time.
Okay, so we've got the description building, we've got the depth perception,
Right.
but what about those pictures that we see in our minds?
Right.
Are they like actual photographs or are they something else entirely?
It's a great question, and one that has led to endless debate.
Really?
Some studies suggest that our mental images are actually picture-like, meaning we can rotate them. We can zoom in,
Okay.
and we even experience illusions with them.
So it's like having a projector in your head.
It's like a little movie theater up there.
That's cool.
But other evidence suggests that they're more abstract,
Okay.
more like descriptions.
Mm,
We can reinterpret ambiguous figures,
like the duck rabbit.
Exactly, like the duck rabbit using mental imagery.
So it's more dynamic than a simple photograph.
Exactly.
That makes sense.
They're not static. They're representations that our brains are actively constructing and modifying.
It makes you wonder if babies have those mental imagery skills from birth
Right.
or if it develops over time.
That's a great question, and it leads us to this really interesting world of infant cognition.
Okay.
Pinker challenges this old view that babies are just in this blooming, buzzing confusion.
I've heard that before.
Right. Turns out they're much more sophisticated than we thought.
They are, but they
Yeah.
can't even talk. So how do we even know what's going on in their little brains?
Researchers have come up with some pretty clever methods.
Okay.
They observe their gaze patterns, their reflexes, their reactions to these unexpected events.
Okay.
And what they found is that even really young babies, like really young,
Mm-hmm.
have this basic understanding of the physical world around them.
So like they understand that objects exist even when they can't see them.
Exactly. Pinker calls it intuitive physics.
Intuitive physics. I like that.
Studies show that babies as young as 3 or 4 months old
Wow. That young.
understand concepts like continuity, meaning that objects don't just disappear and reappear randomly.
So peekaboo is a lesson in object permanence.
You can say that.
Oh, wow.
It taps into that developing understanding of how the world works.
That's so cool.
It's really cool.
So what other physics concepts do babies understand?
So they understand cohesion,
Okay.
that objects are solid and don't just fall apart,
Hmm.
and contact, that objects need to touch each other in order to interact.
So it's like they have a basic physics engine running in their brain from day one.
That's a great way to put it.
Babies are way cooler than I thought.
They are.
Yeah.
They're so much smarter than we give them credit for.
So they get this basic physics,
Yeah.
but what about reasoning? Can they think logically at that age?
That's another area where research has uncovered some pretty surprising abilities.
Okay.
Pinker talks about how babies go beyond this simple similarity-based reasoning.
What do you mean by that?
So think about how we categorize things.
Okay.
We don't just group things together by how they look.
Right.
We use rules and concepts.
Right. A dolphin and a shark look pretty similar.
Yeah.
But one's a mammal, the other's a fish.
Exactly. We categorize based on deeper knowledge.
Right.
Pinker uses this example of chimps and gorillas.
Okay.
Both are primates, visually quite similar,
Right.
but we distinguish them based on their diet.
Oh.
Chimps are omnivores, gorillas are herbivores.
So we're using abstract knowledge, not just appearance.
Exactly.
And babies can do this too.
Studies show that even 9-month-old babies can make similar distinctions.
Wow. Tiny philosophers in diapers. But if babies have this logical capacity, why do we adults make so many logical errors?
Right. We're not always the most rational creatures, are we?
No, not always.
No, not always. So Pinker says that our mental logic is influenced by context,
Yeah.
by our assumptions,
Okay.
and the limits of our working memory. So it's not this perfect formal logic that you might learn in a philosophy class. It's messier.
So are you saying our brains are trying to be efficient?
Yeah.
But those shortcuts sometimes lead us astray.
It's a trade-off, right, between speed and accuracy.
Okay.
Our mental logic has evolved to solve real-world problems quickly, not necessarily to ace these abstract logic puzzles.
Right. Like abstract logic wasn't really crucial for survival back in the day.
Right.
You know, for our ancestors.
Right.
It's all about like getting the food, avoiding the predator.
Right, making those quick decisions.
Yeah, exactly.
So he gives this example of the Watson selection task.
Okay.
It's this classic logic problem where people really struggle with the abstract version, but they do really well when the same logic is presented in this familiar real-world context.
So our brains are better at logic when it's applied to everyday situations.
That's the idea.
Okay, that makes sense.
Makes sense, right?
From an evolutionary perspective.
Exactly.
But what about probability? I always hear that humans are terrible at judging probabilities.
Right.
We fall for all these biases.
Yeah. Pinker actually challenges that notion.
He does.
Yeah, he argues that our intuitions about probability are actually pretty accurate,
Okay.
especially in real-world situations where events aren't perfectly random.
Okay, so what about things like the gambler's fallacy? You know, thinking that a coin is due for tails after a streak of heads.
Yeah, so Pinker points out that the gambler's fallacy is only really a fallacy in artificial contexts, like in casinos where randomness is carefully controlled.
Right, but in real life, events are often dependent on each other.
Exactly. So if a basketball player, for example, makes several shots in a row, it's reasonable to think that they're hot,
Right.
and they might make the next one.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So our probability judgments are shaped by our experience of a world
Right.
where things aren't always perfectly random.
Okay, so we're not inherently bad at probability.
Not necessarily.
We just need to be mindful of the context.
Exactly.
That's good to know. But what about those bigger, more abstract concepts like time,
Right.
relationships, emotions?
Right, it's big, fuzzy concepts.
Yeah, how do our brains even grasp those?
So Pinker argues that we often use metaphors to understand those abstract ideas. We think in terms of space, force, and motion,
Okay.
even when we're dealing with ideas that have no physical form.
So give me an example. How do we use metaphors to understand time?
So we talk about time as if it were this physical path, right?
Okay.
We're moving forward into the future, or we're looking back on the past.
Right.
We use metaphors of force, like time pressure or grasping an idea.
It's true. We're always talking about time as if it were a thing, even though it's this like abstract concept.
Right. But those metaphors aren't just linguistic flourishes.
Okay.
Pinker suggests that they reflect these deeper cognitive structures that shape how we understand and reason about the world.
It's like our brains are using those concrete analogies. to grapple with those more abstract ideas.
It's a workaround, a clever workaround.
It is. It is. And this brings us to another really interesting topic, emotions.
Yes, emotions.
Are emotions just these irrational glitches in our otherwise logical brains?
Pinker argues that emotions are actually sophisticated adaptations,
Okay.
just like those mental modules we talked about earlier.
Right, right.
So they serve specific functions, they provide valuable information,
Mm.
and they guide our behavior in ways that have been, helpful
Okay.
for our survival and reproduction.
Okay, but how can emotions be adaptive? Like, they sometimes lead us to make terrible decisions.
You have to remember that emotions evolved to promote survival and reproduction,
Okay.
not necessarily happiness or well-being in that modern sense.
Right, right.
So think about our ancestors
Okay.
living in a world full of danger.
Right, saber-toothed tigers.
Exactly. So emotions like fear and anger,
Right.
those were crucial for survival.
Okay.
They allowed them to react quickly to threats.
It's like a built-in alarm system,
Exactly. A built-in alarm system.
warning us of danger.
And disgust is our body. It's our body's way of protecting us from things that could harm us, like rotten food or bodily fluids.
It's an internal, ew, get that away from me response.
Right. And while those disgust responses might seem a little overblown in our modern world,
Yeah.
they generally served our ancestors pretty well.
Right, right.
So emotions are part of this evolved toolkit for navigating the world,
I like that.
for making decisions.
Yeah, it's making me rethink how I even view emotions. Instead of trying to suppress them, maybe we should try to understand what they're telling us.
I think that's a really valuable insight.
Yeah.
They're not just these irrational impulses, they're trying to communicate something to us.
What about happiness, though? What's its evolutionary purpose? Are we, programmed to be happy?
That's a great question, and Pinker actually discusses this idea of a hedonic treadmill.
The hedonic treadmill.
Yeah, the idea is that our happiness levels tend to kind of revert back to a baseline,
Okay.
even after these major life events.
So it's like that feeling you get when you buy a new gadget or something.
Exactly. You get that initial rush of joy.
Right.
But eventually, things kind of settle back down.
It's kind of depressing when you think about it.
It might seem that way, but it makes sense, from an evolutionary perspective.
Okay.
If we were constantly blissed out,
Right.
we wouldn't be motivated to do anything.
We need that drive.
Right, exactly. We need that push
Yeah.
to keep us striving,
Hmm.
seeking out those new challenges and rewards.
So instead of chasing these fleeting happiness highs,
Yeah.
maybe we should focus on setting goals that bring a sense of meaning and growth.
I think that's a great way to think about it.
So we're not just wired for happiness, we're wired for progress and challenge.
Exactly. It's about growth.
Right.
It's about pushing ourselves.
I like that.
And, all of this kind of ties into this other fascinating aspect of human behavior, self-control. Why is it so hard to resist that donut even when we know it's not good for us?
Oh, don't even get me started on donuts.
Right.
My willpower just crumbles every time.
Pinker frames this as a battle between our present self
Okay.
and our future self.
Right.
So we're constantly weighing that immediate gratification
Yeah.
against the potential long-term benefits
Yeah.
of, delaying gratification.
It's like, my present self wants that donut.
Right.
But my future self wants to, fit into my jeans.
Exactly. So this internal struggle is actually rooted in our evolutionary past.
Okay.
Our ancestors couldn't always count on the future.
Right.
Sometimes grabbing that immediate reward was really the best strategy.
Yeah, you find a pile of berries.
Right, exactly.
You're not going to wait. You're going to eat them.
You're going to eat them before someone else does.
Yeah.
Or before they go bad.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
And those instincts are still with us,
Mm-hmm.
even though most of us live in this world of abundance.
Right. So we're fighting against millions of years of evolution.
Every time we try to resist temptation.
No wonder it's so hard.
Exactly.
But how do we even manage to save for retirement or stay on a diet?
Right. How do we achieve these long-term goals?
Yeah.
So this is where our capacity for abstract thought and planning comes in.
Okay.
We can use our understanding of the future to kind of override those immediate impulses.
So we can trick our brains
Kind of, yeah.
into thinking that the future reward is more immediate.
It's about finding ways to make those future rewards feel more tangible, more real.
It's like we're negotiating with our evolutionary programming.
Exactly.
It's fascinating, really.
It's so cool to think about, right?
Yeah, it is.
How these ancient mechanisms are still influencing us today.
It makes me think about another interesting aspect of human behavior, altruism.
Okay.
Why do we help others, even when it doesn't directly benefit us?
So Pinker explores different types of altruism,
Mhm.
including kin selection and reciprocal altruism.
Okay, kin selection. What's that?
It's about helping relatives,
Okay.
which makes sense from an evolutionary standpoint because they share our genes.
Yeah. Right, so helping them is like indirectly helping yourself.
Exactly. You're increasing the chances that your genes will be passed on.
Hmm.
So the emotions involved, like love and concern for family, those are real.
Right.
It's just that they evolve because they ultimately serve those genetic interests.
So it's a combination of biology and emotion.
Exactly.
Okay, so what about reciprocal altruism? What's the logic behind helping those who aren't related to us?
So reciprocal altruism is about helping others with the expectation of being helped in return.
So it's like a you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours kind of deal.
Exactly. And this kind of reciprocity fosters cooperation and trust within a group.
Right, like helping your friend move, knowing they'll help you out when you need it.
Right. Pinker talks about how this can be beneficial
Yeah.
for both the individuals involved and the group as a whole.
Right.
It can even contribute to the evolution of these more complex societies.
But if it's all about expecting something in return, can we really call it altruism?
That's a great question, and it's something that's been debated for a long time.
Yeah.
But Pinker's point is that those emotions involved,
Yeah.
like gratitude,
Yeah.
the desire to reciprocate kindness, those are real.
Right.
They likely evolved because they facilitated this cooperation,
Hmm.
this mutual benefit, leading to greater success for the group as a whole.
So we're wired for both selfishness and cooperation.
Right. It's this constant balancing act.
Yeah, always trying to find that equilibrium.
It makes you wonder what other human traits have this hidden evolutionary story behind them.
Yeah. Speaking of which, what about that drive for status and prestige? Is that an evolutionary thing too?
Pinker believes so.
Really?
He argues that our desire for status and prestige
Yeah.
can be traced back to our evolutionary past.
Okay.
Status signals things like good genes, access to resources,
Yeah.
strong social alliances, those kinds of things.
So being popular could actually boosted your chances of passing on your genes.
Exactly. It's not just about vanity, it's about survival.
So that's why we care so much about what other people think.
That's part of it, yeah.
It's kind of like ingrained in us.
Right, and this drive for status can manifest in all sorts of ways.
Okay.
The clothes we wear,
Right.
the cars we drive, the careers we pursue,
Mm.
we're always trying to signal our worth.
It's like we're all players in this elaborate status game, but we don't even realize it.
Right, and Pinker uses this concept of conspicuous consumption to illustrate this.
Conspicuous consumption. Okay.
It's the idea that people spend money on these extravagant things,
Okay.
not because they're useful,
Mm.
but because they signal wealth and status.
Like buying a designer handbag that costs a fortune.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Even though a regular bag would work just as well.
Yeah, it's a way of like showing off.
Yeah, it's a way of showing off, signaling your position in the social hierarchy.
It's fascinating how those seemingly superficial behaviors can have these deep evolutionary roots.
It's really interesting to think about.
It is, but how does this drive for status fit in with like the idea of sharing and reciprocity? Right.
Aren't those two kind of at odds?
Not necessarily, because sharing can actually enhance your status within a group,
Yeah.
especially in environments where resources are unpredictable.
Okay.
Imagine you're a hunter-gatherer and you share your surplus with others.
So you build up a reputation for generosity and trustworthiness?
Exactly.
It's like you're investing in your social capital.
Exactly. You're building this network of support.
Hmm.
And this kind of reciprocal sharing would have been crucial for survival in those, harsh and unpredictable environments.
So generosity is its own reward.
In a way, yeah, it builds trust, strengthens those social bonds.
But generosity and cooperation aren't always the case, are they?
Unfortunately not.
Because humans aren't always altruistic.
Right.
We have a capacity for aggression and violence, too.
We do.
I imagine that also has evolutionary roots.
So Pinker argues that while warfare is not inevitable,
Okay.
it can be understood through this evolutionary lens.
Competition over resources, territory, mates, all these things can escalate into violence and warfare.
So it's like the darker side of that drive for survival and dominance.
Exactly. It's the flip side of that coin.
Okay.
And he discusses this idea called the male warrior hypothesis, which suggests that men in particular have evolved these psychological adaptations for violence, for these group conflicts.
So historically, men have been the primary participants in warfare.
Yeah, that's a general trend.
And that likely stems from those different reproductive strategies of men and women.
Right.
Right. Men who can potentially father many children would be more likely to engage in these risky behaviors.
That's the idea, yeah.
Okay.
But it's important to remember, understanding the evolutionary roots of a behavior doesn't justify it morally.
Right. Of course not.
So while we might have these predispositions for violence, we also have this capacity for reason, for empathy, for cooperation.
Right.
We can choose to overcome those baser instincts.
We can choose a different path.
Exactly. We can choose to build a more peaceful world.
I like that it's a reminder that we're not just slaves to our biology.
Absolutely. We have agency.
But before we wrap up this section, I have one more question that's been bugging me.
Okay.
We've talked about all these practical behaviors, that have this evolutionary basis.
Yeah. Finding food, avoiding danger, attracting mates.
Exactly.
Right.
But what about things like art, music, storytelling?
Ah, yes, the things that make life worth living.
Right, but they don't seem to have any obvious survival value.
Right.
So how do they fit into this whole evolutionary picture?
Pinker tackles this head-on, and he proposes that even those seemingly frivolous activities
Okay.
can actually serve these adaptive functions.
Really? So they're not just useless distractions?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
So, for example, think about fictional narratives.
Okay.
They can help us prepare for those social dilemmas.
Hmm.
They can help us explore different strategies for dealing with conflict.
So reading a novel could actually make me better at dealing with real-life drama.
It's possible.
Mm-hmm.
And music can facilitate social bonding,
Right.
evoke these powerful emotions, transmit cultural knowledge.
So these activities, they might seem frivolous on the surface,
Right.
but they're tapping into this evolved cognitive machinery, offering hidden benefits.
Exactly. It's like we're wired for creativity and self-expression.
It's part of what makes us human.
Right. It's part of what makes us unique.
Exactly. It's a reminder that evolution doesn't just select for the practical.
Right.
It also selects for the things that enrich our lives, that make us who we are.
Absolutely. And that's what makes studying the mind so fascinating, right?
It is.
There's always something new to discover.
There is.
It's this constant exploration.
Okay, so we've journeyed through the sounds of language, the structure of grammar.
Right.
We've seen how language influences our thoughts and shapes our social interactions.
It's been quite a journey.
It has. It has.
And we've only just scratched the surface.
But language is not just about words and sentences, right?
How?
It's about stories.
It is. It's how we connect, how we share, how we make sense of the world.
Stories are how we make sense of the world, pass down knowledge, and connect with each other on this deeper emotional level.
Absolutely. Pinker calls stories the flight simulator for human social life.
I love that analogy.
It's perfect.
It's a great way to think about it.
So by immersing ourselves in these fictional worlds,
Yeah.
we can safely explore different social scenarios,
Right.
test out strategies, learn valuable lessons
Yeah.
without having to face the real-world consequences.
It's a dress rehearsal for life.
It's like a cheat sheet for life.
Exactly. Think about it. How many times have you learned something valuable from a character in a book
Oh, yeah. All
or
the
movie,
Yeah.
even though it wasn't a real person?
Yeah, yeah.
We can experience these different perspectives,
Right.
try on different roles, gain insights that might help us navigate our own social lives. And Pinker says that this capacity for storytelling is deeply rooted in our evolutionary history.
Absolutely.
Right? Like, I imagine our ancestors sitting around the campfire,
Yeah.
sharing tales of hunts, battles, encounters with spirits.
It was their way of transmitting knowledge,
Right, building social cohesion.
Yeah, passing down these moral values, these lessons.
So stories help shape their understanding of the world and their place in it.
Exactly, and that primal need for stories is still with us today.
It really is. We devour novels, we binge watch shows, we go to the movies.
Right, we're constantly seeking that immersive experience
Yeah.
that transports us
Right.
and allows us to connect.
It's more than just entertainment, right?
Oh, absolutely.
It's a fundamental part of how we make sense of life.
I think that's a great point.
Yeah.
It's how we understand ourselves, how we relate to others.
But stories aren't always about escaping reality, are they?
No, they're also about understanding ourselves.
Right. We tell stories about ourselves, about our lives all
Yeah.
the time.
Exactly. And Pinker argues that those personal narratives,
Mm-hmm.
the stories we tell ourselves and others about who we are,
Right.
play this crucial role in shaping our identity.
It's how we make sense of our past, our present, our future.
Exactly, and they connect us with other people.
Right.
They share our unique perspective.
And those stories change over time, don't they?
They do. They evolve.
Yeah.
Shaped by our experiences, relationship.
The things that happen to us.
Right, even the cultural narratives that surround us.
So it's like we're constantly revising and refining our personal narratives as we grow and change.
It's an ongoing process
Yeah.
of self-discovery and storytelling.
Right.
It's this essential part of being human.
It is.
It helps us create meaning, find purpose, connect with others.
It makes me wonder, what about the stories we tell ourselves that aren't necessarily true?
Ooh, interesting.
You know, those little white lies, the self-deception.
Right, the stories we tell ourselves to make us feel better.
Yeah, to protect our egos.
Yeah, exactly. And Pinker actually suggests that this can sometimes be a useful strategy.
Wait, are you saying that lying to ourselves can be a good thing?
Not necessarily lying, but maybe bending the truth a little, putting a positive spin on things.
But how can that be helpful?
So he argues that a bit of self-deception can boost our confidence,
Okay.
motivate us to persevere,
Right.
help us cope with those difficult situations.
So sometimes believing in ourselves, even if it's a little bit inflated,
Yeah.
can be the key to achieving our goals.
It can give us that extra push,
Okay.
that extra bit of motivation.
But how do we know when that self-deception is becoming, harmful?
That's a great question, and it's one that Pinker grapples with as well.
Yeah.
He acknowledges that too much self-deception can lead to denial, delusion,
Right.
even harmful behaviors.
So it's about finding that balance, right?
Exactly, finding that sweet spot.
Between believing in yourself
Yeah.
and being honest with yourself.
Right, it's a delicate balance.
It is.
But it's about recognizing the power of those stories,
Yeah.
both the ones we tell ourselves
Right.
and the ones that we consume,
Right.
and using that knowledge to create a more fulfilling life.
Okay, that's great. That makes sense.
So it's not just about the content of the story, it's about how we use it
Right.
to shape our understanding of ourselves and the world around us.
This has been an amazing journey through the world of stories.
It really has.
We've explored those evolutionary roots,
Yeah,
their power to shape our thoughts and behaviors.
absolutely.
And even, the potential benefits of a little self-deception.
It's been quite an exploration.
It has.
And it all comes back to this incredible capacity of the human mind to create and share those narratives
Yeah,
that connect us and make us who we are.
it really is amazing.
It is.
Okay, we've been talking a lot about the mind. And
Yeah.
all these processes, these functions.
Right.
But what about the physical brain itself?
Ah, the hardware.
Right. Doesn't that play a role in all of this?
Yeah, absolutely. The brain is the physical substrate that makes all this mental activity possible. It's remarkable. Billions of neurons,
Yeah.
all interconnected.
Like the ultimate biological supercomputer.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
And, understanding how the brain works at the level of neurons and synapses,
Right.
that's crucial for unraveling these mysteries of the mind.
I've always been so curious about that. Like, are there specific parts of the brain that are responsible for specific functions?
Right.
Is there a language area or a love center?
So it's more complicated than that.
Okay.
While some regions are specialized for certain functions, most mental processes actually involve multiple brain areas working together.
Okay.
So it's not just about assigning one function to one location.
So it's more like a network than like a collection of isolated compartments.
Exactly. It's like an orchestra. Each instrument plays its part,
Yeah.
but it's the symphony as a whole that creates that beautiful music.
Yeah. I love that analogy. But can you give me some examples of like key brain structures and what they do?
Sure. So let's start with the cerebral cortex.
Okay.
It's the outermost layer of the brain.
Okay.
And it's kind of like the command center,
Okay.
responsible for those higher level cognitive functions.
So that's where all the big decisions get made.
You could say that.
Okay.
And the cortex is divided into these different lobes,
Okay.
each specialized for certain functions.
Okay.
So, for example, the frontal lobe is crucial for what we call executive functions, like planning, decision-making, inhibiting impulses.
So that's where my willpower resides.
Well, willpower is complex.
Yeah.
It involves a lot of different brain areas.
Right.
But the frontal lobe definitely plays a key role.
Okay.
And then you have the parietal lobe,
Okay.
which processes sensory information like touch, temperature, spatial awareness.
What about the temporal lobe?
The temporal lobe is crucial for processing auditory information,
Okay.
memory, language comprehension.
And the occipital lobe.
That's at the back of the brain, and it's all about visual processing.
So each lobe has its own specialty,
Yeah,
but they all work together
right.
to create this unified
That's
experience.
the beauty of it.
Yeah.
And then beneath the cortex,
Mm.
you have all these other brain structures that are essential for different functions.
Okay.
The hippocampus.
Oh, the hippocampus. The one you always hear about for memory?
It's all about forming those new memories.
Right.
Damage to...
So it's like the brain's switchboard.
Exactly. Making sure all the signals are going where they need to go.
It's incredible how all these different parts can work together
It's amazing.
in such a coordinated way.
And this is just a glimpse,
Yep.
into the complexity of the brain.
It is.
There's so many other structures, circuits
Right.
contributing to, everything we experience.
Right. It makes you realize how much we still have to learn
It really does.
about this incredible organ.
Yeah.
But it makes me wonder how much of our personality, our intelligence, our talents, how much is that determined by our genes versus our environment?
It's the nature-nurture debate again.
It always comes back to that, doesn't it?
It does, because it's so fundamental to who we are.
It is.
Pinker acknowledges that it's rarely an either-or situation.
Okay.
He presents evidence that both genes and environment play a significant role in shaping who we are.
So it's not nature versus nurture.
Right.
But nature and nurture working together.
Exactly. It's this complex interaction.
Mm-hmm.
Our genes provide that blueprint, but our environment, experiences, choices, those all shape how that blueprint unfolds.
It's like having a recipe for a cake.
Okay, I like that.
The ingredients are important, but so is the oven temperature, the baking time, even the decorations you add.
That's a great analogy.
It is.
And Pinker actually talks about twin studies,
Right.
adoption studies, even research on these gene-environment interactions to kind of disentangle this complex interplay between nature and nurture.
So what does all this research tell us? Can we actually put a number on it? Like, how much of our personality is genes versus environment?
It's not always that easy
Okay.
because different traits have varying degrees of what we call heritability,
Okay.
meaning the proportion of variation in a trait that's due to genetic differences.
Mm.
So some things like height, eye color, those are highly heritable,
Right.
while others like personality, intelligence,
Okay.
those are more complex, influenced by a lot of different factors.
So even with identical twins raised in the exact same environment,
Yeah.
there can be these subtle differences.
Right, and those differences really highlight the importance of individual experience choices
Yeah.
in shaping who we are.
It's a reminder that we're not just like predetermined by our genes.
Right.
We have agency. We have the power to make choices.
And that's empowering, right?
It is. It is.
It means we're not just passive products of our biology.
Right. And understanding this complex interplay can help us create more supportive environments, right?
Absolutely.
For people to thrive.
It's about recognizing the role of both nature and nurture
Yeah.
and creating environments that support growth and well-being.
Okay. So we've explored the brain, the nature-nurture debate, even the fascinating world of stories.
It's been a lot.
It has.
A whirlwind tour of the human mind.
It really has, but it feels like we've just scratched the surface.
We have. There's so much more to explore.
It is a little overwhelming, but also incredibly exciting.
Right.
It really is.
It's like the mind is this ultimate frontier, and we're just starting to understand it.
Pinker himself acknowledges that there's still so much we don't know about the mind.
Right, and that's what keeps us going.
It
It's
does.
the mystery, the challenge
It is.
that drives us to keep exploring.
And this quest to understand the human mind,
Yeah,
it's one of the most important things we can do
absolutely.
as a species.
It is.
Because it's about understanding who we are, where we came from, and what makes us tick.
Right, it's about unlocking the potential of the human mind
It is.
and using that knowledge to create a better future.
I like that. It's not just about satisfying our curiosity.
Right.
There are real-world applications.
Well, absolutely.
It's about making the world a better place.
So, for example, if we understand how our minds work,
Yeah.
we can design better educational systems.
Okay.
We can develop more effective therapies
Right.
for those struggling with mental health disorders,
Hmm.
and even create technologies that enhance our cognitive abilities.
So it's like we're using the power of science to improve the human condition.
That's a great way to put it.
It is. It is. It's exciting.
It's very exciting, but it's also important to think about the potential downsides,
Okay.
because this knowledge could be misused.
It's like any powerful tool, right?
Exactly. It depends on who's wielding it
Right.
and what their intentions are.
So it's up to us to make sure that this knowledge is used ethically, responsibly, to promote well-being and create a more just world.
I couldn't agree more. It's a huge responsibility.
It is.
We can't just explore the mind out of curiosity.
Right.
We have to think about those consequences
Right.
and use this knowledge wisely.
Yeah. Okay, so we've talked about a lot in this section, from the building blocks of language to the power of stories,
Yeah.
and even the intricate workings of the brain.
It's been quite a ride.
But now I want to shift gears and explore something a little more practical: how we learn and how we can improve our learning abilities.
The art and science of learning. One of my
Yeah.
favorite topics.
Me too. I'm always looking for new ways to boost my brain power, become a better learner.
And Pinker offers some really valuable insights into how learning works.
Okay.
Drawing from research in cognitive science, psychology, even neuroscience.
Okay, so where do we begin?
Pinker suggests we start by understanding these fundamental principles
Okay. The,
that underlie how our brains acquire and retain information.
okay.
He talks about the importance of attention, repetition, and meaningful connections.
Okay, let's break that down. What do you mean by attention?
Attention is the gateway to learning.
Okay.
You can't really learn something if you're not paying attention to it.
Makes sense.
So he emphasizes focusing our mental resources, minimizing those distractions.
So like putting away my phone,
Right.
finding a quiet place to study.
Exactly. Creating an environment that's conducive to learning.
So that's actually backed by science.
Absolutely. Our brains aren't really designed for multitasking.
Uh.
When we try to juggle too many things at once, our attention kind of gets fragmented
Right.
and we don't learn as well.
Yeah.
So single tasking, that's key.
That's the key.
It's a huge part of it. And then there's repetition.
Yep. Yeah.
We learn by repeatedly exposing ourselves to the information.
Practice makes perfect.
That's the saying.
Right.
But it's not just about mindless repetition. It's about spacing out those repetitions.
Okay.
Pinker talks about the spacing effect,
Okay.
that we remember information better when we space it out.
So those late night cram sessions might not be the best strategy?
Probably not the most effective, no.
Okay, so spacing things out, even if it's just for a few minutes each day, that's better?
It can make a huge difference, yeah.
Mm.
Because it gives your brain that time to really process,
Okay.
consolidate the information, make those connections stronger,
Got it.
and then there are those meaningful connections.
You're right. What does that mean in the context of learning?
So our brains are wired to find patterns to make those connections.
Yeah.
And we learn best when we can relate that new information to something we already know.
So it's not just memorizing facts, it's understanding how they all fit together.
Exactly. So Pinker suggests that we should be trying to create this mental model of the topic we're learning, like building this framework that makes sense, that connects to what we already know.
So it's like building a mental map
Right, exactly.
instead of just collecting these random landmarks.
I love that analogy. That's a great way to think about it.
And this is where techniques like active recall,
Yeah.
spaced repetition,
Right.
elaborative interrogation come in.
All those fancy terms.
Right. They sound interesting. Can you explain those a little bit?
Sure. So active recall is about testing yourself on the material,
Oh,
forcing your brain to retrieve that information from memory.
So instead of just highlighting things in a textbook,
Right.
I should be actively trying to recall the information without looking.
Exactly. It's like a workout for your brain. And then spaced repetition, which we talked about, is about reviewing that material at those increasing intervals
Right.
to make those memories stronger.
Right. Okay. And elaborative interrogation.
That's about asking those why questions
Okay.
about the material you're learning.
Okay.
It's forcing yourself to explain the concepts, to make those connections more explicit.
So instead of just accepting a fact
Right.
at face value, I should be asking myself, why is this true? How does this connect to what I already know?
Exactly. You're engaging with that material.
Okay.
On this deeper level, you're not just passively absorbing it.
These are great tips. I'm definitely going to try incorporating them.
I hope they're helpful.
But what about those times when I'm just feeling stuck? Like my brain just won't cooperate.
Yeah, I think we've all been there.
Does Pinker have any advice for those mental roadblocks?
He does. He talks about the importance of sleep, exercise, and even taking breaks.
Wait, taking breaks can actually help me learn better.
Absolutely. Our brains need time to rest, But
Yeah.
to consolidate information,
Right.
pushing ourselves too hard can actually be counterproductive.
So stepping away from my desk,
Yeah.
going for a walk, that could help me remember something I'm trying to learn.
It's very possible.
That's wild.
And sleep is crucial,
Right.
essential, really, for memory consolidation.
Okay.
When we sleep, our brains are replaying the events of the day, strengthening connections, transferring information into long-term memory.
So those all-nighters before a big test might not be the best idea?
Probably not the best strategy.
Okay.
You're better off getting a good night's sleep.
This is making me rethink my entire approach to studying.
Yeah, it's all about finding that balance.
Maybe I need to prioritize sleep more, take more breaks.
Right, finding what works best for you. We all have different learning styles, preferences.
That's a good point.
There's no one-size-fits-all approach.
But what about people who just seem to be, like, naturally gifted learners? Are they just born with better brains?
Pinker challenges that idea of innate talent. He argues that while genetics might play a role,
Yeah.
most exceptional performers are the product of hard work, dedication,
Okay.
effective learning strategies. They've put in the time.
Right, so it's more about deliberate practice than just natural ability.
Exactly. Those who really excel in their fields, they've spent thousands of hours honing those skills.
It's a reminder that greatness isn't just handed to you.
Right. It's earned.
You have to work for it.
Absolutely. And understanding how learning works can empower us to become better learners,
Okay.
regardless of where we're starting from.
This has been a really insightful conversation about learning. I feel like I've got a whole new set of tools to approach my studies
I'm glad it's been helpful.
and improve my cognitive abilities.
It's been a pleasure sharing these ideas with you.
Yeah, it has been. Learning truly is a lifelong journey, isn't it?
Absolutely. And there's always more to learn and explore.
There is. There is. Okay, so we've talked about the mind as a computer,
Right.
the power of language, the power of stories, the incredible complexity of the brain, even how to become better learners.
It's been quite a journey through the landscape of the human mind.
It really has. But there's one question that's been lingering in my mind this whole time.
Okay, what is it?
What does it all mean? Like, why should we even care about understanding how our minds work?
That's the big question.
It is. It is. Like, what's the point of all this?
Well, Pinker argues that understanding the human mind isn't just this intellectual exercise.
Okay.
It's actually this really practical endeavor with profound implications for our lives, for society as a whole.
Okay, so it's not just about satisfying our curiosity.
Right. It's about understanding ourselves
Hmm.
to improve our lives
Right.
and the world around us.
So there are real-world applications for this knowledge.
Absolutely. For example, if we understand how our minds work,
Yeah.
we can design those better educational systems,
Okay.
more effective therapies for mental health,
Right, right.
even create those technologies that enhance our cognitive abilities.
So we can use the power of science to improve the human condition.
I think that's a beautiful way to put it.
I like that.
It's about empowerment,
Yeah.
creating a better future.
But what about the potential downsides? Could this knowledge be misused?
That's a valid concern, and it's one that Pinker acknowledges.
Mm.
Any scientific knowledge, including knowledge about the mind,
Right.
it can be used for good or for bad.
It's like any powerful tool, right?
Exactly. It depends on the wielder and their intentions.
It really comes down to us, doesn't it?
It does.
To make sure that this knowledge is used ethically, responsibly.
We have a responsibility to steer this knowledge in the right direction,
A huge responsibility.
to promote well-being,
Yeah.
to create a more just and equitable world.
This has been a truly mind-expanding deep dive. We've explored so much, from the basic building blocks of thought
Yeah.
to this complex interplay between genes and environment, and even those ethical implications of understanding the human mind.
It's been quite a journey.
It really has, but it's been amazing.
I'm glad you enjoyed it.
I have, and I hope this deep dive has sparked your curiosity, listener, and inspired you to keep exploring the wonders of your own mind.
Because the mind is a powerful tool.
It is, and with knowledge, awareness, and a little bit of effort, you can unlock its full potential.
So keep exploring, keep learning.
And never stop asking questions.
Because the more we understand about the human mind.
The more we understand about ourselves and the world around us.
Thanks for joining us on this adventure.
Until next time, keep those brains buzzing.